They thought she was invisible, but they forgot the most dangerous eyes in the room were watching everything. Naomi Carter's hands moved in slow, steady circles across the marble floor, the cold seeping through her thin uniform as laughter echoed above her like a storm. She had learned not to fight. Crystal glasses clinked, heels clicked. Expensive fabric brushed past her shoulders, as if she were part of the ground itself, just something to step over, not someone to see. Someone behind her chuckled, low and amused. Careful, you might miss a spot. And a splash of red wine followed, spreading across the spotless floor. She had just finished cleaning, the liquid creeping toward her fingers like a quiet insult. Naomi paused for half a second, not long enough for anyone to notice, then reached for the cloth again, her movements precise, controlled, practiced like she had done this 1,000 times before, because she had a man near the bar leaned in with a grin that didn't belong to kindness and dropped a crumpled bill beside her. "Make it shine this time," he said, and the group around him laughed louder, now the kind of laughter that fed on silence. And Naomi gave them exactly that silence. Her head lowered, her curls tied back neatly, her eyes focused on the stain instead of the faces above her. But something in her stillness was different, not broken, not defeated, just unshaken. The chandelier above cast golden light across the polished floor, reflecting everything, the luxury, the arrogance, the illusion of power. And in that reflection, Naomi saw herself small, but steady, grounded in something none of them could touch. Upstairs, behind tinted glass, Leonardo Voss stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the scene unfold without a word, his expression unreadable, as if he were observing a quiet experiment rather than a party. Below him, a woman laughed sharply. "I give her 10 minutes before she snaps." Another voice replied, "She won't. People like her never do." Leonardo's gaze didn't move from Naomi as she wiped away the wine, her movements calm, even as another guest deliberately stepped through the wet floor, leaving fresh marks behind her, work undone again, and still she didn't react, didn't look up, didn't ask for respect. And that was the moment something shifted, not in the room, but in him. Because strength didn't always look like power. Sometimes it looked like restraint, sometimes it looked like a woman on her knees choosing dignity over anger. And as the laughter grew louder, and the test reached its peak, Leonardo turned and began walking downstairs, each step measured, each second stretching the tension tighter, until even the music seemed to fade. And when he finally stepped onto the marble floor, the room didn't stop immediately, but it would in just a moment, because the next words he spoke were not for the crowd, they were for her, and they would decide everything. The sound of his shoes against the marble was soft but deliberate, and one by one conversations began to fade, not because he raised his voice, but because presence like his did not need to announce itself. Naomi noticed the shift before she saw him, the laughter thinning the air, tightening, the weight of attention settling over the room like a slow-moving shadow. Her hand paused mid-motion, cloth still pressed against the floor as a pair of polished black shoes stopped just inches from where she knelt. She lifted her eyes slowly, not all the way, just enough to see the crease of tailored fabric, the quiet authority and stillness. And then his voice came, low, steady, impossible to ignore. "Look at me." It was not loud, but it carried through the silence that followed. And for the first time that night, Naomi raised her head fully, her gaze meeting his without defiance, without fear, just clarity. Leonardo Voss studied her for a moment longer than anyone else ever had, not her uniform, not the position she was in, but her expression, the calm that refused to break under pressure. The room waited. Someone near the bar shifted uncomfortably. Another forced a quiet laugh that died halfway through because no one else joined. And then he asked the question, "If I gave you power right now, what would you do with it?" A simple question placed in a room built on status and control, and yet it landed heavier than any command. Naomi blinked once, not in confusion, but in consideration, as if she took the question seriously in a way no one else there would have expected. She did not rush to answer. She did not look around for approval. She simply breathed, in steady and quiet. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, but it did not waver. "I would give it back to people like me, so we would not have to beg for something that should already be ours." The words settled into the space between them, and for a moment no one moved, no glass clinked, no music filled the silence. It stretched wide and complete. Leonardo's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, almost imperceptible, recognition perhaps, or respect, something earned without asking. The man who had thrown the bill earlier let out a nervous chuckle, trying to recover control. "It is just a maid talking big," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Leonardo did not look at him, not yet his attention remained fixed on Naomi, as if the rest of the room had disappeared. "Stand up," he said, and this time it was not a request. Naomi hesitated only briefly, not out of fear, but out of habit, because she had been taught to stay low, to stay unseen, but something in his tone cut through that conditioning, and slowly she rose to her feet. The room watched closely, now seeing her differently, not because she had changed, but because someone powerful had chosen to see her. Leonardo stepped back slightly, giving her space, as if acknowledging her presence rather than towering over it. And then finally, he turned his gaze to the rest of the room, and when he did, the shift was immediate. The same people who had laughed minutes ago now avoided his eyes. The energy reversed, the balance corrected without a single raised voice. "Interesting," he said quietly, and the word carried more weight than judgment, because what came next was not about anger, it was about truth. And in that moment, everyone in that room realized this had never been entertainment, it had been a test. And they had already failed. No one spoke at first, because silence like that did not come from fear, it came from realization. Leonardo Voss moved slowly through the room, his gaze passing over each guest, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, clarity, the kind that stripped away pretense. The man who had thrown the bill shifted his weight, attempting a smile that never fully formed. "It was just a joke," he said, but the words sounded hollow, even to himself. Leonardo stopped in front of him, not close enough to intimidate, but far enough to make the distance feel intentional. "A joke requires everyone to laugh," he replied calmly, and again the room fell into that same heavy quiet, the kind that pressed against the chest. Naomi stood still behind him, her hands at her sides, no longer holding the cloth, no longer kneeling, no longer part of the floor, and for the first time since the night began, people looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her ass. If trying to understand what had just shifted, Leonardo turned slightly, gesturing toward the polished marble beneath them. "This floor was cleaner before any of you arrived," he said, and though his tone remained even, the meaning landed with unmistakable weight. A woman near the window lowered her glass, her fingers tightening around the stem, as if unsure where to place it now. Without drawing attention to herself, another guest adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware of how out of place confidence could feel when it was no longer shared. Leonardo continued, walking his steps, unhurried, deliberate. "I invited each of you here because I believed you understood what it meant to carry responsibility," he said. "Not just wealth, not just influence, but responsibility." His eyes lifted briefly, meeting one pair after another, and each time the person looked away, first Naomi felt the air shift again, but this time it was not pressure, it was release, like something invisible had broken apart, revealing what had always been there underneath. "Respect is not something you demand from people beneath you," Leonardo said quietly. "It is something you demonstrate when no one is watching." He paused, then glanced back toward Naomi, and for a moment the distance between them felt different, no longer divided by status, but connected by recognition. And tonight, only one person in this room understood that. The words did not need emphasis, they did not need explanation, because everyone already knew who he meant. The man by the bar exhaled sharply, his earlier confidence completely gone. "You are serious about this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Leonardo faced him again, this time with finality. "Completely," he said, and there was no anger in it, no raised voice, no display of dominance, just certainty, the kind that left no space for argument. One by one, people began to step back, not told to leave, but understanding they were no longer part of what mattered. Their conversations reduced to quiet murmurs, their laughter gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. Naomi remained where she was, still processing the shift, still standing in a space that had once forced her to kneel. Leonardo turned fully toward her now, and for the first time his expression softened, not dramatically, not enough for others to notice, but enough for her to see. "What is your name?" he asked, and though it was a simple question, it carried something new. Acknowledgement. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Naomi Carter," she answered, and this time, when she spoke, the room did not laugh, it listened. And that was the moment everything changed, not because power had spoken, but because dignity had been recognized, and once seen it could not be ignored. Naomi Carter, the name settled into the room with a quiet weight that no one dared interrupt, and Leonardo Voss nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not as an employer noting staff, but as a man recognizing something rare. "Naomi," he repeated softly, and the way he said it made it clear he would not forget it. The guests shifted uneasily around them, their earlier confidence dissolved into something uncertain, something smaller, because the rules they had relied on had just changed. Without warning, Leonardo turned slightly, gesturing toward the grand space around them, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the walls lined with art that spoke of wealth and legacy. Everything you see here was built on decisions, he said calmly. Not just business decisions, but human ones, choices about who deserves respect and who does not. His voice remained even, but every word landed with precision. And tonight those choices were made very clearly. A man near the back cleared his throat, attempting to recover control. We did not know this was some kind of test, he said, carefully choosing his words. Leonardo looked at him. Briefly, not with anger, but with something more final than that. That is exactly the point, he replied. Character is only real when it is not announced in advance. The man fell silent immediately, because there was nothing left to argue. Naomi stood still, absorbing everything, not the attention, not the shift in power, but the truth behind it. She had not changed anything. She had simply refused to become what they expected, and somehow that had been enough. Leonardo stepped closer again, but this time there was no tension in the movement, no sense of judgment, only intention. How long have you been working here? He asked. Naomi answered without hesitation, 3 weeks. Her voice steady, grounded in the same quiet strength that had carried her through the night. Leonardo's gaze lingered for a moment, as if measuring something unseen, then he nodded again. And in those 3 weeks no one thought to ask your name. It was not a question, but the silence that followed confirmed the answer louder than words. Naomi did not look at the others. She did not need to. Their avoidance said everything. Leonardo turned back to the room one final time. This evening was meant to determine who I move forward with, he said, and now the meaning was unmistakable. The stakes that had been invisible before were suddenly clear. Partnership is not about numbers alone. It is about judgment, about knowing the difference between value and appearance. He paused, letting that settle into every corner of the room. And tonight only one person demonstrated that understanding. No one spoke, no one moved, because they already knew the outcome without him having to say it directly. One by one, people began to step away, quietly collecting their things, their earlier laughter replaced with something heavier, reflection perhaps, or regret. But Leonardo did not watch them leave. His attention returned to Naomi, fully present, fully aware. You should not be on your knees in a room like this, he said simply, not as criticism, but as acknowledgement. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then answered in the same calm tone. I did what I had to do. Leonardo considered that response carefully, then nodded once more. That may be true, he said, but it will not always be necessary. The words were not a promise, not yet, but they carried the weight of possibility, something that had not existed for her when the night began. And as the last of the guests moved toward the exit, the room grew quieter, not empty, but changed like a stage after the performance had ended, leaving only what mattered behind. And in that silence, Naomi realized something had shifted, not just in how they saw her, but in what was now possible for her. And Leonardo Voss, who had watched everything from the beginning, had already decided that this was only the start. The room had emptied, but the silence it left behind felt fuller than the noise that once filled it. Naomi stood in the center of the marble floor, no longer surrounded by laughter or judgment, just the soft echo of footsteps fading into distant hallways. The chandeliers still glowed above, casting warm light across a space that now felt entirely different, as if the air itself had been cleared. Leonardo Voss remained where he was, his posture relaxed, yet deliberate, as though nothing that had happened surprised him, yet everything had confirmed something he had been waiting to see. Do you know why they laughed? He asked quietly. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood the weight of the question. She looked down briefly at the cloth still in her hand, then back up at him. Because they could, she said simply. Leonardo nodded once. And because they believed there would be no consequence, he added, his voice calm but precise. Naomi considered that for a moment, then spoke again. People show who they are when they think no one is paying attention. A faint shift crossed his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to agreement. Exactly, he said, the word landing softly between them, like confirmation rather than praise. He walked a few steps across the floor, his gaze moving over the room, not searching, not judging, just observing the aftermath of choices made without thought. I have spent years building this world, he said, and I have learned that the most dangerous weakness is not lack of intelligence or ambition, it is the absence of respect. He paused, then looked back at her fully. Tonight, you showed me something none of them could. Naomi did not react outwardly, She did not step forward or lower her gaze. She simply stood there grounded in the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything. Leonardo studied her for a moment longer, then spoke again. What brought you here, Naomi Carter? It was not a question about employment. It was a question about life, about the path that had led her to that floor. In that moment, Naomi exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of truth. I needed the job, she said. My mother is sick and my younger brother is still in school, so I take whatever work I can find. Her voice remained steady, but there was something deeper beneath it, not weakness, not desperation, just honesty. Leonardo listened without interruption, his attention fixed entirely on her words, as if nothing else existed in that space. And you chose to stay silent tonight, he said. Naomi nodded slightly. Because reacting would not change who they are, she replied. It would only change who I am. The words settled heavily in the quiet room, and for a brief moment Leonardo said nothing at all. Then he stepped closer again, not imposing, not overwhelming, just present. There are very few people who understand that difference, he said softly. Fewer who live by it. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. It is not always easy, she admitted, but it is necessary. Leonardo nodded once more, as if something had just been confirmed beyond doubt. Then perhaps you are exactly where you need to be, he said, this sentence simple, yet layered with meaning. Naomi did not fully understand, yet she felt it, the shift, the possibility, the beginning of something she had not expected. When she first knelt on that cold floor, and as the quiet stretched between them, it became clear that this was no longer about what had happened earlier in the night. It was about what would happen next. And for the first time, Naomi Carter was no longer invisible in a world that had always refused to see her. The quiet between them no longer felt uncertain, it felt intentional, as if the night had narrowed down to this single moment. Naomi Carter, standing where she once knelt, and Leonardo Voss, seeing her not as part of the background, but as someone who had altered the entire room. Without raising her voice, he turned slightly toward the large windows where the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a reminder of how many people lived unseen beneath that glow. There are thousands of people working in this city right now, doing what they must to survive, he said calmly. Most of them will never be noticed, not because they lack value, but because no one takes the time to look. Naomi followed his gaze for a brief second, then returned her eyes to him. That does not change what they are worth, she replied quietly. Leonardo nodded, as if that answer aligned perfectly with something already forming in his mind. No, it does not, he agreed. Then after a short pause he added, but it does change what opportunities reach them. The words lingered, and Naomi understood there was more beneath them than a simple observation. She remained still, waiting, not expectant, not hopeful, just present. Leonardo turned back to face her fully, his expression thoughtful, measured, as though every word that followed had already been weighed carefully. I do not believe in charity, he said, not the kind that gives without understanding. Naomi listened closely, her posture unchanged, but her attention sharpened. But I do believe in recognizing potential when it proves itself, he continued. And tonight, you did something most people in this room could not. You chose who you were going to be, even when it would have been easier to become something else. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth still in her hand, not out of nervousness, but because the words carried truth she had lived with for years. It was not about them, she said softly. It was about me. Leonardo gave a small nod, acknowledging the distinction. Exactly, he said, and then he stepped closer again, not closing distance to assert control, but to make the conversation personal, intentional. So I am going to ask you something different now, he continued, not as your employer, but as someone who pays attention. Naomi met his gaze fully, her eyes steady, ready. If you were given a chance to step out of this role, not because someone felt sorry for you, but because you earned it, would you take it? The question did not rush her, it did not demand an answer, it simply existed between them, waiting. Naomi inhaled slowly, considering not the risk, but the meaning behind it, because she understood this was not about a job, it was about a shift, something larger than the floor she had been cleaning moments ago. I would, she said finally, her voice calm, but certain, as long as it does not require me to become someone I am not. Leonardo's expression changed just slightly, not surprise, not doubt, but recognition again, that same quiet acknowledgement that had been building since the moment he noticed her. That is the only kind of answer that matters, he replied, and for the first time that night the power in the room felt balanced, not tilted, not imposed, but shared in understanding. And as the city lights flickered beyond the glass, and the last echoes of the evening disappeared, it became clear that what had started as a test had turned into something else entirely, a decision that would not only change Naomi Carter's path, but redefine what Leonardo Voss expected from the world around him. Leonardo Voss did not speak immediately after her answer, because moments like that required space, not interruption, the kind of silence that allowed truth to settle fully before anything else could shape it. Naomi Carter remained steady in front of him, her posture unchanged, but something within her had shifted, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in awareness that the direction of her life had just been placed in her own hands in a way it had never been before. Leonardo walked slowly toward the long table where untouched glasses still reflected the soft chandelier light. He picked one up, turning it slightly between his fingers, as if considering something beyond the surface. Most people believe opportunity is given, he said calmly. They wait for it, they hope for it, they think it arrives when someone notices them. He placed the glass back down gently, the sound barely audible. But the truth is, opportunity responds to something much rarer. It responds to consistency in character, especially when no one is rewarding it. Naomi listened without moving, her eyes never leaving him, because she understood now that every word carried intention, not just observation. Tonight you were not being evaluated for your work, he continued. You were being observed for your choices. He turned to face her again fully. And you never once chose the easier path. Naomi considered that quietly, then replied, the easier path does not always lead to the right place. Leonardo nodded once, a subtle confirmation that she had understood more than most ever would. Exactly, he said again, and this time the word carried a quiet finality, as if a decision had already been made. He stepped closer, once more stopping at a distance that felt balanced, not above, not below, just equal in presence. So this is what will happen next, he said, his tone steady and clear. Naomi did not interrupt, she simply waited, because she had learned that listening at the right moment mattered more than speaking. Starting tomorrow you will not be assigned to cleaning duties, he continued. You will work directly with my operations team, observing, learning, understanding how decisions are made and why. Naomi's expression did not change outwardly, but inside something tightened, not fear, but the weight of responsibility, because she knew this was not a gesture, it was a shift. You will not be treated differently because of sympathy, Leonardo added. You will be expected to earn your place every day, just as you did tonight. Naomi nodded once, accepting not just the opportunity, but the expectation that came with it. That is fair, she said simply. Leonardo studied her for a moment longer, then asked one final question. And if you find that this path is more difficult than anything you have faced before, he paused just slightly, will you still choose to stay? Naomi did not hesitate this time. Yes, she answered, her voice calm and certain. Because difficulty does not define whether something is right, it only reveals whether it matters. For the first time that night, a faint hint of approval crossed Leonardo's expression, not visible to most, but clear enough for her to see. Good, he said quietly, and then he stepped back just slightly, not ending the moment, but completing it. Then we begin tomorrow. The words were simple, but they marked a turning point that neither of them would ignore. And as Naomi stood there, no longer holding a cloth, no longer confined to the role she had been given, it became clear that what had started as a night of quiet humiliation had transformed into something far greater, a recognition that dignity, when held firmly enough, could change not only how the world saw you, but what the world offered you in return. And Leonardo Voss had just chosen to invest in that truth. The night did not end with applause, it ended with understanding, the kind that lingered long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed behind the last guest. Naomi Carter stepped out of the grand hall into a quieter corridor, the marble beneath her feet now echoing differently, no longer a place where she had been overlooked, but a place that had witnessed her being seen for the first time. She paused for a moment near the tall windows, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, its lights flickering like distant reminders that countless lives moved forward without ever intersecting with moments like this. But hers had just shifted, and she could feel it, not as excitement, not as relief, but as something steadier, something deeper, purpose. Leonardo Voss remained inside for a while longer, finishing what he had started, not with commands or corrections, but with silence, allowing the weight of the evening to settle into the walls themselves. Because spaces like that remembered things, not words, not actions, but the energy left behind. And tonight it had changed when he finally stepped into the corridor, he found Naomi still there, not waiting, not lingering, just present, as if she had not yet decided whether to leave or stay. Most people would have walked out already, he said quietly. Naomi turned slightly, meeting his gaze. Most people would not know what to do next, she replied. Leonardo gave a faint nod, acknowledging the truth in that answer. And you do, he asked, not as a challenge, but as curiosity. Naomi looked out at the city once more before responding. I know that whatever comes next, it will not be given to me, it will be built step by step, just like everything else I have done. Her voice carried no hesitation, only clarity. Leonardo studied her for a moment, then spoke again. That is exactly why you are here, he said, the words simple but final, because you understand that nothing worth having arrives without intention. Naomi turned back to face him fully, now the distance between them no longer defined by position but by choice. Then I will not waste it, she said. Leonardo did not respond immediately, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was confirming, as if something had just been solidified without the need for further explanation. A staff member passed quietly down the hallway, glancing briefly at Naomi, then looking again, this time with recognition rather than dismissal, and that small moment carried more significance than anything said earlier, because change was not always loud. Sometimes it was subtle, a shift in how one person looked at another, and what that meant moving forward. Leonardo noticed it too, not the glance itself, but what it represented. It begins with small things, he said, the way people look at you, the way they speak to you, the way they consider you before making a decision. Naomi listened closely, understanding that those small things were never truly small, they were the foundation of everything else. And it continues with larger ones, he added, the choices you will have to make when you are no longer on the outside observing, but on the inside deciding. Naomi nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what that meant. Not just opportunity, but responsibility, not just change, but expectation. I understand, she said, and this time there was no hesitation at all. Leonardo gave a final nod, then stepped past her, moving toward the exit of the corridor, his pace steady, his presence unchanged, but something about the moment lingered, as if the night itself had left a mark that would not fade. Naomi remained where she was for a second longer, then looked down at her hands, no longer holding a cloth, no longer defined by the work she had been doing earlier, but by the choices she had made instead. And as she lifted her gaze back to the city beyond the glass, she realized something that would stay with her long after this night ended. Nothing about what had happened was accidental, not the laughter, not the silence, not even the question that changed everything. Because sometimes the world did not test you to break you, sometimes it tested you to reveal who you had already chosen to be, and whether you were ready for what came after. Morning arrived without ceremony, but everything about it felt different. The same building, the same marble floors, the same quiet hum of early movement, yet nothing carried the same weight. Naomi Carter stepped through the entrance, not as someone trying to remain unseen, but as someone aware that every step now meant something more. The staff who passed her offered brief nods, small acknowledgments that would have gone unnoticed before, but now felt deliberate, not exaggerated, not forced. Just different, and that difference spoke louder than anything else. Leonardo Voss was already in his office, the city stretching behind him through floor to ceiling glass, the light of a new day casting long reflections across the room. As Naomi entered, he did not immediately turn. His focus remained on the skyline for a moment, as if measuring time itself before finally speaking. Most people think change feels dramatic, he said calmly, like something obvious, something loud. He turned, then his gaze steady. But real change is quiet. It happens in the way you walk into a room, and the way a room responds. Naomi stepped forward, her posture composed, her presence grounded in the same quiet certainty that had carried her through the night before. I noticed, she said simply. Leonardo nodded once, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. This time the word carried no authority to command, only invitation. Naomi sat, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with awareness that this moment was no longer about proving anything, it was about beginning something. From this point forward, you will see things most people are never allowed to see, Leonardo continued. Not because they are hidden, but because they are not trusted to understand them. Naomi listened closely, her attention unwavering. Trust is not given lightly, she said. Leonardo's expression shifted slightly, acknowledging the truth in that statement. No, it is not, he agreed. And it is not permanent. It is maintained through every decision, every action, every choice you make when no one is watching. Naomi nodded once, absorbing the weight of that responsibility. because she understood now that this was not an end, it was a test of a different kind, one that would not happen in a single night. But over time, Leonardo stepped around his desk, placing a thin folder in front of her, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just as part of what came next. Your first task is simple, he said. Observe, listen, understand how decisions are made before you ever try to influence them. Naomi placed her hand lightly on the folder, not opening it yet, but recognizing what it represented, not just work, but entry into a world she had never been part of before. And if I see something that should be different? She asked. Leonardo looked at her directly. Then you remember what you said last night, he replied. You do not become like them, you remain who you are, and you let that guide your actions. Naomi met his gaze, steady and certain. I will, she said, the words quiet but firm, and in that moment, there was no longer any question about where she stood. Not in the room, not in this new path, not in herself. Leonardo gave a final nod, then stepped back slightly, not ending the conversation, but allowing it to settle into something real, something lasting. And as Naomi opened the folder for the first time, the sunlight shifted across the desk, illuminating both the past she had come from and the future she was now stepping into, because sometimes the world does not change in a single moment. Sometimes it reveals that change has already begun long before anyone else noticed, and that day the world remembered what dignity looks like.